our guest this week offers what I think is a compelling look into a faith tradition we don't often encounter in these kinds of conversion stories. Our guest is Dustin Shane, a convert from the Jehovah's Witness faith, who became Catholic after a long journey, actually longer than I realized it would be, out of the Jehovah's Witness faith into Catholicism. Spent some time actually then afterwards exploring some Reformed traditions, some serious Protestantism, before becoming Catholic, dabbling in Eastern Orthodoxy for a bit, but remaining in the Catholic faith. It's a fascinating story of somebody on a real spiritual journey, coming from a place where not a lot of us know a lot about. I have a deep family connection to this faith tradition, which you'll hear about on the show. So this for me is particularly interesting, but I think for everyone, a real good deep dive into a place we don't often go to, but really it's fascinating. Guys, your prayers are appreciated all over this episode. So please watch, enjoy, and learn something new. All right, friends, welcome back to the show. Thanks for watching. Thank you for listening. If you're listening on podcast, hey, your ratings and reviews on Apple Podcasts, on Spotify go a long way to help pushing this podcast out to new listeners. So please do, if you can, leave a rating and a review. And if you're watching on YouTube, thanks for watching, guys. Subscribe to this channel, hit the bell, interact in the comments, do all those fun YouTube things that you guys do, and do interact, join this conversation. We're happy to have you. I'm happy to have my guest this week. I'm joined by Dustin Shane. He's a convert to Catholicism from the Jehovah's Witnesses. He's a husband, a father, a lecturer, urban planner, a writer, and an artist. That's lots of things. I love it. And he's good at all of those things. I'll tell you what. He's the author of The Watchtower and the Cross, and his work, which focuses on bringing a re-enchanted Catholic imagination to culture and daily life, can be found at shanelore.com. I'll put links to that in the show notes. I gotta tell you, Dustin, I was lost in there for quite a while this afternoon when I was looking at just checking it out. I kept going deeper and deeper and deeper. It's fantastic stuff. Welcome to the show, Dustin. Happy to have you here. And hello.
Thanks, Keith. Yeah, glad to be here.
This is going to be an awesome conversation because, first of all, it's a unique story. We don't get converts from Jehovah's Witness every day on the show. It's a pretty interesting, I think, place to come from that none of the listeners be familiar with. Those that will be highly enriched by this conversation, I'm sure, and those that are like wondering, I think we'll get a lot out of this really interesting and unique perspective. And I gotta say, at the beginning, this for me is especially interesting because of my own family history. I was kind of raised nominally Christian. My parents on both sides, my dad's and my mom's parents were nominally Christian. My mom's family was semi-estranged because a bunch of those family members were Jehovah's Witnesses. And so growing up, we had these aunts and uncles who, they wouldn't do birthdays, didn't do Christmas. We saw them occasionally, and it was always a point to avoid mentioning those things. And we knew them a little bit, and I didn't find out till later, probably in high school, when I became evangelical Christian, and then later Catholic a number of years later. But my mom was cleaning out some of her closets, and I noticed a rosary and an old Bible on her bed, and I was a pretty new Christian. I said, "Mom, what are those? Like, where did those come from?" Because we were a nominally Christian household, we didn't have those kind of things laying around, and no Catholic heritage whatsoever. I thought Dustin to have a rosary, and she said, "Oh, they're my grandmother's," and I said, "What do you mean? Like your grandmother's Jehovah's Witness? I know her. She lives in the farm out there in the country. All her brothers and sisters are Jehovah's Witnesses." Well, it turns out that my mom's parents came from Poland to Canada as kind of refugees during the Second World War. And there was a great big push at the time from the Jehovah's Witnesses to kind of evangelize these immigrants coming to Canada quite aggressively, and quite an anti-Roman Catholic kind of bent. And so they were targeting, I learned this later in some history classes I took, they're targeting Catholics coming to Canada. And so I didn't know, and found out at that time, that I had Catholic heritage on my mom's side, these deeply devout Polish Catholics who only lost their faith when they came to Canada and kind of were radically evangelized and became Jehovah's Witnesses. And so I gotta say, Dustin, this for me is a cool connection because I gotta think now that these, I don't know the state of the eternal soul of my great grandparents whatsoever, but I gotta think that there's a lineage of Catholics in my past I had no idea existed, because when I met them, they left that faith. Now, whether they returned again at some point, right? I only God knows their hearts and how that works. But uh, stories like yours, I'm like, yeah, I want to know more about this, because personally, I feel deeply invested in these stories. So I'm pretty excited.
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned kind of family history and lineage because that's for one thing, that's me and my wife's main hobby is genealogy. We love it. We eat it up. But it kind of forms part of my story. I talk about it in the book, of kind of how that Catholic heritage going way back. Because you go back far enough, everybody's Catholic. Coming from Europe. Um, but the Jehovah Witness tradition that kind of entered into my family uh, came a few generations back for me, and so it was kind of a very deep background. Some of my family were some of the first Jehovah's Witnesses in the Nashville, Tennessee area, kind of the early 20th century. So I kind of came up in it, and it was kind of just totally immersed in it, for several generations. And uh, just it's a very intense lifestyle. I mean, if you've had some uh, relationship to it, there used to be 3 meetings a week that you attended. Meetings were kind of the worship, uh, what they called worship. A lot of it was a more kind of an educational seminar type setup is the way they did it. And then on top of that, you had your evangelization time on Saturday, which they called going door to door. It's kind of what witnesses are known for. That itself was like 3 hours. And you had to prepare for that, and you had to memorize things that you would say to people as you cold called just random people every Saturday. So it was an intense lifestyle to kind of be brought up in.
Yeah, it's funny because you mentioned that, of course, the door to door thing is what the Jehovah's Witnesses are known for. We always were trained by my mom to be so polite when they came, because she goes, your great grandma's doing this somewhere, right around town somewhere, and your aunts are doing this around town. Imagine this is your grandma. You get nice to her. They might be annoying you at dinner time or something, middle of the day, and you're right, you're not interested, but you gotta show respect and kindness, because this is your relatives are out there doing that too. So I always took that to heart. So you mentioned generations going back. I mean, take us back. Where does this story begin for you, for your family, for your history in the faith?
Yeah, I mean, I think on my dad's side, it starts with I won't go into all the details, but my great great grandfather was kind of a down and out type fella, I guess, in the 40s or 50s. And he was the first one that was baptized and died a witness. Um, and the witnesses kind of cultivate a very anti worldly mentality. And I think that maybe was something that drew him just from my research about his life circumstances and kind of him going from job to job and kind of how he ended up. And that was inculcated in our family. Witnesses are anti higher education. It's not a complete prohibition, but it's frowned upon to go to college. Um, that kind of limits some of your job prospects in some ways. So um, you know it was kind of a spare existence, and but there was a lot of love, in the family growing up. That I won't speak ill of my parents as far as being as their job as parents. My dad was he was a disciplinarian, but he was also very compassionate, and I think he really took to heart and ran with the gospel elements that are in the Jehovah's Witnesses.
Yeah, so you were raised in that culture, in that faith tradition, pretty intense. It sounds like. Was was there any? Was there any other faith around you? Was that kind of what you knew? 'Cause I mean, growing up when you're a kid, right? What you know is the faith of your parents. Maybe some of your friends you might know a bit about how they believe or live their lives. What was it? Was it quite insular for you, or did you have exposure to other, like faith traditions, like say for example, the Catholic Church growing up?
Yeah, so I grew up out in rural Tennessee, and there weren't many Catholics around. There are a lot of Baptists, a lot of Methodists, and then what we call Church of Christ, which is um, it's kind of related to Disciples of Christ, which you might see in some other areas of the country. Um, but that was kind of the milieu that I grew up in. I it's funny to say I didn't know a lot about them. We're kept sort of separate now. The witnesses don't do a lot of homeschooling for some reason, but so I went to public school, but we don't. There still was like a wall of separation between us. You know, we weren't allowed to associate outside school hours with people that weren't witnesses. You were kept very much inside that community. So I didn't know a lot about them. I didn't even know that they believed in the Trinity. I thought that was something only Catholics believed in. You know, yeah. So, um, and you're not allowed to read or study what other religions teach. I remember one time going out door to door, we met a Muslim, excuse me, a Mormon, uh, out in the door to door ministry, and they said, "Hey, I'll take your watchtower if you'll take my Book of Mormon." And I don't know, 15 or something, and I was like, sure, let's do a even trade. And I got back to the car, and my dad was like, we don't do that. Like, we don't take, that's false religion. You know, we're only looking for those people that are seeking truth. So it's very insular, not just physically but mentally. You know, you're not exposed to a lot of other belief systems or ideas, or encouraged to kind of intellectually grapple with other idea systems. And a lot of that can actually be you can be disciplined for if you read things that are not written by witnesses, or certainly things that are critical of the Jehovah Witness organization.
Interesting. Yeah. So it's not as if you're being equipped to go out and do apologetics. Like we would think of like having answers to questions that would be debated because you don't know a lot about those who are doing the debates. Is that fair to say? That's pretty interesting perspective.
Yeah, they produce a lot of literature that's kind of aimed at like a apologetics on the street kind of thing. And so you have a lot of stock answers lined up for kind of a caricature of belief that's presented to you that other people believe in. It's called the Reasoning Book. We used to carry that around, and it has stuff in there about if you come upon a Catholic, if you come upon a Buddhist, how do you argue against praying to Mary, and all of these other things. So you have a resource that kind of gets you through 90% of your conversations, because most people out there are going to be less educated in these subjects than we were. You know, most people aren't attending educational seminars every week to learn how to refute other people's religions like we were. So, but every once in a while you come upon somebody that's, you know, into their faith, you know, and I've heard stories of this, and just kind of get blown away, you know, because they've kind of looked at both sides and you haven't.
Yeah. We when my son was quite young, probably around I don't know, 2 or 3, we were walking down the street and these two Mormon missionaries, these two women Mormon missionaries approached us and said, "Hey, do you know who Jesus is?" And my son pipes up because we were Catholic. Yeah, of course I know who he is. He's this, this, and this, and this. And they were blown away because they're, whoa, wow, okay, this guy, they know. It was pretty awesome. So you
Yeah.
talked about going door to door. What was it like for you, that growing up process, that kind of coming into your own process as a Jehovah's Witness in this faith tradition? Um, I don't know when your Catholic inclinings kind of begin, but what was it like, kind of coming into your own in that faith tradition?
Yeah, I mean, I was kind of a sensitive, serious boy growing up, and I took my faith very seriously, and I kind of became, I don't want to, kind of a little child prodigy Jehovah Witness, and I was given, they start you out giving talks in front of the whole congregation as early as you want to. I mean, I've heard of 6-year-olds. So I was up there 7 or 8 years old, addressing the congregation, reading the Bible, giving my little prepared speeches, and then you're going out and doing this every Saturday as well. So and with my dad, he was that was the most important thing to him in his life, was the Jehovah Witness religion. He used to tell me, he said, I don't care about your grades. I don't care about the job you get, as long as you remain a servant of Jehovah. And that was his focus. So, I mean, I obviously took that in, and had a great relationship with him growing up until kind of my teen years started. And I think kind of the discontent started, you get to middle school and you kind of come up against the world, and if you're from a kind of fundamentalist or Christian background, you come up against all those influences of things that are opposed to your worldview and way of life, and you ask questions. And I think for me, it was I was kind of so neurotic about it. I was getting into my studies and doing all the work that you have to do to be a witness, because it's really never ends. They tell you could always study more, you could always give more things up for the watchtower. Um, and I was coming home and I was confessing my sins to my dad, because there's no confession, but there's a lot of very rule based spirituality. And I think just the weight of all that just kind of was just too much for me. I started to see my friends going out and getting girlfriends, and starting to watch movies I couldn't watch, and maybe go hang out with friends from school or go to parties. And I started to just, think like, this just can't be right. Like, this guilt I'm feeling, it's not fun. It's, God is always, he's after me with all his rules. So I think that was when I started looking for a way, a rationale. And we got the internet. I mean, that was back in the late '90s, so it was dial up, but you could use it. You could look up atheist websites, and stuff about uh, atheistic evolution and all these things. And I know there's a whole debate about evolution within the church and so forth, and there's a lot more flexibility in the church on this issue. But back with the witnesses, you do not believe in evolution. It is a lie. um, and so when I kind of discovered the whole scientific discourse on that, and some of those arguments against certain readings of the Old Testament, I mean, my faith just kind of crumbled um, uh, pretty quickly, and I kind of set sail into the world. Now, I will pause and say that the problem was, in my enthusiasm growing up as a witness, I had already gotten baptized, um, which was a big mistake, because witnesses, which it's funny because they don't believe it's a sacrament. It's kind of like the Baptists that believing it's an ordinance, or some type of just outward symbol. There's nothing intrinsic or sacramental about it, but it's also something that you can never be released from as a witness for some reason. So I got baptized at age 11, which is early for a witness. Most witnesses wait until they're 15 or 16, which I think is wise, because then you've kind of shown your colors and the direction you're going. Um, but I think they wanted me baptized because they knew, hey, this could help him stay on the straight and narrow. Because once you get baptized as a witness, you're liable to be shunned. If you commit some serious sin that's found out, or if you leave and join another religion, you're shunned, and that applies to your close family as well. So
Interesting. So in a sense, it's the kind of indelible mark that the church believes it is, the Catholic Church believes it is, but in as you describe it, kind of maybe almost a negative kind of safeguard against, well, now, okay, now we're serious. Now you really better like stay on that straight and narrow. That's pretty interesting, right? And you mentioned the whole thing about shunning. I'm curious, other kind of differences. I mean, maybe we'll get into this more as we compare the Catholic Church to what you grew up with. But was there anything else like that? You mentioned confession to your dad, like, and it sounds like some of these things are problematic in hindsight. And obviously there was tension there as you're growing up. You faced these rules and couldn't do these other things other people were doing. And I'm wondering, did you encounter, especially when you began to use the internet, maybe did you encounter things that made you realize that what you were doing was kind of uniquely this thing that other Christians, others in the world, apart from your friends who were watching movies you couldn't watch and those kind of things, did you get the sense that this was different? This was something that was unique?
Yeah, I mean, even on a just run of the mill spirituality, it's just different. As a witness, um, there's a lot of emphasis on the point of history is the sovereignty of Jehovah God, they call it. And so the Garden of Eden was Adam's refusal of that sovereignty, and the course of history has been man's attempts to govern himself. So they frame it in this way that governance is the problem, and that's why they don't support any human government. They're completely neutral in political matters, and that's part of their religion. Is any government is an attempt by man to govern himself apart from God. So, but one of the weird ways that plays out is they don't really have a concept of providence. Um, so they kind of sneer, like when you might say, well, God took that person, or God took them to a better place. They're in a better place now, or it was God's mysterious will. They really have a problem with that, because for them, from the point of Adam until the second coming, it's Satan is running this world. The scripture says the world is lying in the power of the wicked one. They kind of use that verse and say, God is his hands are off the steering wheel. Satan's running this thing. God will fix it at the end of time. But it's very insulting to God to say that he has anything to do with the terrible situation of this world. This is man and God. So you almost kind of live like an atheist, because everything is just cruel happenstance or Satan. I mean, and they admit God will intervene at certain times, like with Christ coming to the earth, or certain miracles that can be worked. But so it's you even sense that the Protestants I knew, that they had a different type of faith. It was more of an immediate living thing for them, God, this relationship with God. Whereas with me, it was more like, well, God is kind of later on. He's letting this thing go, and we're just kind of like hanging on
It's
until
really
he fixes it
fascinating.
later.
So we left you kind of middle schoolish with the internet. Dangerous time.
Yeah.
Where'd you go next from there? I know I had to laugh because I became evangelical Christian around probably around the same time, in the early era of the internet, and I attempted to become Wiccan at one point because I met a guy at a party who was this really cool, mysterious guy, and he told us he was Wiccan. And I remember trying to Google. It wasn't even Google actually. It was like web crawler or one of these much older search engines. I think it's in pre Yahoo, trying to search up what a Wiccan was and just couldn't find anything. I couldn't find any good sources. What I found was just terrible and confusing and contradictory. And so I avoided Wiccanism because the internet wasn't good enough yet. So I'm grateful for that. I'm grateful for that. But here you are, kind of encountering these ideas, kind of for the first time. Where did you go from then?
I kind of dived headfirst into the whole set of beliefs, new atheist, secularist, progressive politics. I mean, I kind of became hostile to everything that I had been and that was around me. I mean, I was in kind of rural Tennessee, so it was still fairly a veneer of Christianity at that time. I don't know if that seems to have kind of changed, but um, conservative politics. I was against all that, and um, it led to kind of chasing, you know, fame, for lack of a better word, with alcohol and just that whole story, that so many teens kind of end up in, and because for me that was the whole point of life. I mean, I kind of took my politics in a religious direction. I kind of started to spiritualize a lot of that stuff, and that became my purpose. I eventually kind of got into like communism and anarchism, and kind of all those religious impulses kind of bubbled up as like the proletariat rising up, became kind of the point of history and like what I was going to work for. Um, I kind of halfway got involved with some, you know, campaigns for raising wages and so forth, which is nothing wrong with that. But I even printed a little newspaper. I printed 1,000 copies of some little newspaper that I'd written about radical politics that I thought was going to start the revolution there in West Nashville. And but all this time, my drinking was getting heavier and heavier. And so, like that, I went out to hawk my paper, but I was half lit when I did that, and so I was not very effective. Um, so, that just I kind of just kept spiraling and becoming more and more dependent on alcohol. Um, and to make a long story short, kind of got to the end of my rope with it, and got to a point where I said something's got to change. I was drinking a couple times a week, to blackout. I was drinking before my shifts at work, you know, um, and they were apparently trying to fire me. They were trying to catch me at that time. I didn't know that. My grades were getting shaky in college. This is my junior year of college. So kind of everything was closing in. Um, my philosophy and the way I'd been running my life wasn't working. And it would call, after one really egregious bender that went a couple days, and wherein I'd called out of work and some various other things. I was at work, and I I was just telling somebody, hey, I think I need to go to AA. I'd heard about AA, didn't know anything about it, and it probably still smelled like alcohol from the day before. Um, but on his way back out of the store, somebody had entered the store I didn't know, and on his way back out, a small kind of man with goatee and glasses, he just walked up to me and he handed me his phone number, and he said, "My name's Eric. I heard you say something about AA. You call me if you want to know more." And um, I can't tell you why, but that was the kind of thunderclap of God's presence in my life. And I went outside. I was kind of tearing up, and I knew, just what I mean. Like, and I know some people kind of scoff at these like coincidence proofs of God's existence, but it really was the timing and where I was, and just the improbability of it, and just what it meant for me at that moment. I knew that God was seeking me. That there was some kind of God, and there was some kind of purpose in this universe. Um, and before that, I had been kind of more open to religion, because as a man of the people, I was trying to fight for the people, as a anarchist, a communist, or whatever. And I'd realized that a lot of working people are religious. People go to church, and it's kind of elitist to scoff at church and belief. So I had kind of become open to, well, maybe I could find a church, and it could actually help me spread the revolution. It could be a social thing. Um, and it was kind of like God was kind of cracking the door with that. But the only problem was, we're in the South here, and it's mostly Protestant. I think, the diocese to the east of us, Knoxville, is the least Catholic diocese in the United States. Nashville, I think, is like second or third or something. So it's not very Catholic here. But I kept like finding this weird attraction to the Catholic Church. I went into a bookstore one time, I think in the midst of my drinking and looking for, some kind of Zen peace or something, like I need some spiritual something. And there was a book by Thomas Merton called like The Monastic Path. And I just grabbed it. I was like, oh, monks, monks know about peace. Um, and just started reading it. And I liked the parts where he was talking about finding peace and acceptance. But then when he was talking about the Holy Trinity, I was like, I don't know about all that. But I had become open, is what I'll say. And I'd become open kind of to Catholicism, which I didn't really want to be because it didn't really fit my political goals. I wanted to be more like Baptist or something, so I'd have more of a pedigree that would work with my goals or whatever. But um, you know, God kind of, the hound of heaven's persistent. So um, anyways, just kind of to bring it back around, I'm now believing in God. I'm starting my AA journey with Eric, who is the best spiritual guide I've ever had. Um, and I was so desperate that I stayed on the path with the program. And AA is basically just Christianity stripped of the proper names. I mean, I think there was a Catholic priest involved in setting it up, and it's very clearly that's what it is. But it having it stripped down that way helps a lot of people who have a lot of hangups about religion, I guess. So I got sober. I learned a new way of life, one that was based on acceptance and not fighting reality the way I had been, and reliance on a higher power or God instead of reliance on a drug that would never fulfill me or do what I wanted it to do. So I'd become open to God, and I'd become open to religion, but I wasn't. Funny enough, I wasn't quite open to truth yet, if that makes any sense, because I still thought, well, I could be Christian, I could maybe even be Catholic, but I don't think I don't know about it being the truth. And so, like, I got involved in RCIA, and and God bless those folks, it was a good program, but it wasn't real heavy on the dogma and doctrine and apologetics. So I kind of came through it with just thinking like I could just do this thing culturally, and it's a nice gloss for my spirituality, but it's not the truth. And I actually became Catholic kind of under that delusion, um, which is it's kind of a weird roundabout story here, but um, it wasn't until my senior year when I was in my senior year of college, and I was in Washington D.C. on an internship up there, and somebody gave me a book called More Than a Carpenter by I think the McDowell brothers, and it's a Protestant little apologetic work about why Jesus is historical and um, why it makes sense to believe in Christianity. A lot of it's based off Lewis. Some of it's based off archaeology and different things. Uh, and this book rocked my world. This little simple apologetical work, pop apologetics, I guess you'd call it. But I mean, some of the stuff in there, I was like, this really can't be refuted. I mean, it can be doubted, but if you're just being honest, like the, Jesus rising from the dead is the least crazy explanation for the first century of Christianity. I mean, just the facts are the facts there. So that was kind of my entry into the idea of truth after I'd already accepted God and even become Catholic. I kind of finally accepted like there could be a capital T truth. Um, and then kind of the tug of war began in my soul between Protestantism and Catholicism because I guess it chalk it up to my baptism, the grace of that. Now that I'd been baptized Catholic, I just could not stay away from mass. And like I remember it was in DC, and the basilica up there is so amazing. And they have daily mass in the crypt church down there. And I would shoot up there on the train on lunch or whatever and try to go to mass. And then that weekend I'd go back and start digging into my Reformed Protestant apologetics, reading about why the Catholic Church is false, and I just kind of went back and forth. And I read this one Dutch Reform guy, Abraham Kuyper, I think his name is, and he gave a really good defense of a lot of the things about Reformed Protestantism. Saying that yeah, there's no images, and that can be hard for people, but that actually proves that it's a higher level of spirituality to have no art, no images, everything's spare, bare, because that was one thing that really got to me, was that Catholicism was so beautiful. It was just so like um, overflowing. It was so busy and full. Like, you know what I mean? You couldn't like capture it in your mind. There was just so much to it. And it seemed to me like that's what the truth would be like. It would be something that seemed kind of overpowering and even magical. But I thought, maybe I've just watched too much Lord of the Rings, and I just have all these medieval ideas. That's why I'm so attracted to it. But I ended up kind of settling on Protestantism, and the reason was, and I tried to, I think this was a good reason, because I knelt down one day and I got saved. Um, I prayed the prayer. Now, I had already been saved, obviously, I believe, as a Catholic, but um, I got saved praying that prayer that they instruct you to pray, and I felt a real difference for several days. I really think that was a grace filled encounter somehow. God was using what He had with me at that time. And then I got rebaptized at a Baptist church there, kind of as like a coming out party. Is like, yeah, I'm real Christian now. I've been saved. Um, so it was just a back and forth, and it was actually that summer when I was back home, and just couldn't stay away. I had to listen to debates on YouTube, and I listened to this. Funny enough, I think it was a Sedevacantist uh, guy arguing with a Baptist about faith alone, and because I kind of settled on like, hey, it's about, is it salvation by faith alone, or is it by faith and works? That's, Luther said, here's where I stand. I can't do no other. And it was when that domino fell, hearing this Sedevacantist defend the Catholic view of salvation, and showing what Paul meant by those scriptures about, not saved by works but saved by faith and all that, that finally the walls fell, and I said, okay. And I marched myself down to my local Catholic parish and made a good confession, and then started going to mass.
So you done a couple of years of the AA, it sounds like, and were curious enough about the Catholic Church to do RCIA. And even though it wasn't super engaging, you went ahead and became Catholic, and that kind of then haunts you for the next little bit, right? I think that's
Hmm.
really interesting, because it's kind of like I mean, obviously you leave this pretty intense faith of your childhood, of growing up, and you're obviously looking, you said yourself, there's that kind of the void there you're looking to fill. You go to look for Zen stuff in a bookstore, like looking for kind of answers, and you encounter kind of a not super compelling Catholicism, but it's enough to keep going back, right? And I find it interesting that you make that conversion, but then you're still wrestling with that and still investigating and still kind of debating that in your mind and watching these things. Uh, that's pretty backwards, but pretty interesting. That because obviously then like that, that the grace of your baptism, the grace of your right of your conversion. You said the Hound of Heaven. I love that picture. And this is I gotta say, Dustin, like the fourth time that's come up in the last like number of weeks. So something is going on here on this podcast. This is haunting our podcast now. The Hound of Heaven is something's brewing here. But I love that image, right? You can't escape that no matter where you go. The other compelling arguments that kind of draw you out. Uh, that's pretty fascinating.
Yeah. So I mean, and then it was, let's start living as a Catholic. Let's and I had a great parish I got involved in. They were kind of a more traditional parish. They did a Latin mass, but they also did mostly the Novus Ordo, but in a very dignified way. Um, got involved with their Scola. Was learning the chants and the traditions of the church and the liturgical year, and really just entering into that. And kind of was a really peaceful time, and kind of out of that, I started thinking about what I wanted to do with my life, and I realized that I'd always had an attraction to military service. Um, and as a witness, that's a shunning offense. So you cannot vote, and you cannot hold office, and you can't join the military. You can't be a police officer either. You can't do anything that's part of government that could involve force at all. Um, so I thought about it, and I was like, well, I'm Catholic, and this is what I'm gonna do, and I'm hopefully gonna marry a Catholic at some point, and I know at that point I'll have to get married in the church, in a church, and my parents will find out about that. So I I was actually living secretly as a Catholic at this time. My parents did not know. I mean, I had moved out by this point. I was living in Nashville with a roommate. They did not know I was Catholic. Um, but I realized like they were gonna find out at some point. So um, and I kind of thought, I was in my early getting to mid 20s, and I thought, if I'm gonna do the military thing, I need to go ahead and do it. Um, so I kind of just put the two together and decided I would go ahead and join the Marine Corps and tell my parents I was Catholic at the same time, which which sounds very cruel, to drop two bombs like that on your poor Jehovah Witness parents at one time. But the reason I did it like that was, for that year my sister got married in September, and I was in the wedding, and it was very beautiful. Um, I was scheduled to go to boot camp the whole time, but I didn't tell them that because if I whenever at whatever point I told them, I would have gotten shunned at that point, and contact would have ceased. So I talked to my priest and everything, and it's like, yeah, just wait. So I waited until the night before I shipped off because I wanted to have as much time with them as I could before before the end came. Uh, so it was a pretty dark night. We just moved my grandma out of her house into a nursing home, a Catholic nursing home, actually, ironically. Um, and we were driving home, and I told my dad, I said, I'm joining the Marine Corps and I'm Catholic. And he said, "Well, I figured you had joined the Marines because my best friend had, and they knew that." He's like, "You've been acting weird, but I didn't expect you to say you were Catholic." And he said, like, yeah, we went back and forth on that, but they won't engage you much on it because that's not. Um, I hate to say it this way, but they're not allowed to. They're not allowed to engage in that way. I got home, told my mother, she was completely demolished by that, and went to bed, and then woke up in the morning. My best friend, pulled up outside the front door, and we went off to medical processing, and then started our boot camp journey. So it was tough.
That yeah, I mean, to put it mildly, that's tough. I mean, it's that's got to be really impossible. I mean, because you're making a decision that you know is going to cut you off from your family, right? That's really intense. It's really really intense.
Yeah, yeah, and it was about to get more intense because, like I said, we went to boot camp, and that's an intense place. Um, Luckily, I had met a lady that lived here in Nashville, and she's kind of a fixture of the Catholic community here. Alice is her name, and one of her sons is actually a priest now, and she kind of understood my situation, understood what was going to happen to me, and became my Catholic mom. I called her third mom because I had my birth mom, the Blessed Mother, and then this lady. So she wrote me letters while I was. You can't call people; you just write letters. So she wrote me letters while I was in boot camp, and we corresponded. And then she gave me a place to land when I came back into town. So thank God for her and my community, that my parish there that supported me during that time. So but yeah, it was crazy. But so we didn't have much time to wait to think about it. So we uh, joined the Marines and went through military training, and uh, had my service adventure, which is something I'd always kind of dreamed about. Going to different countries and so forth, and training with weapons and all these other things that you do. It's and salute having that pride of patriotism and the flag. I can tear up at the national anthem now. It's just things that I didn't have because as a witness, you don't have a country. You don't have. You're not allowed to. Um, and it's this is one of the things I love about Catholicism. It's the divine balance of Catholicism, because Catholicism can allow you to be of your country, of your place, while still being, a servant of Christ first and foremost. It doesn't try to destroy these other loyalties, because it's not afraid of them. Whereas Watchtower, I mean, they even go so far as to destroy family, because even it is a threat to its supremacy. So you don't have a country, you don't have any of that. So being a Catholic and being able to balance those things and understand, you know, good, healthy patriotism has been a great blessing in my life.
That's phenomenal. What was it like? I mean, so you do the military thing. You're obviously practicing your Catholic faith. You're digging into it. Do you? I mean, what comes next? Is there turmoil? I mean, you've broken a relationship like that. That's like not you've broken it, but it's become fractured as a result of this. Like you're kind of, I don't know, on your own now. It seems like, right? That's a new Catholic kind of settling in your faith, out on your own. Seems like kind of a scary place. Like what was that like?
Yeah, I mean, I can only chalk it up to grace as to how you kind of
Yeah,
kind
yeah.
of keep going. But yeah, it was lonely. I mean, they wouldn't. The first letter I wrote them, they bagged it up and sent it back unopened. I
Oh,
mean, it was very much, we are not communicating with you. I mean, I was allowed to come home and get my things and see them for 15 minutes while I did that. You know, but all the family, family gatherings, vacations, just hanging out, checking up, calling, all that stuff just has ceased ever since.
yeah,
And they've stayed, because if they don't, they will get shunned. It's
yeah,
it's very punitive. It's not. A lot of times, I think well-meaning people will be like, "Oh, well, I had my friend was Church of Christ and he converted, and his family came around eventually. They were mad at first, but they came around, and that's not what's going on here though. This is a very much bureaucratically, juridically enforced situation. I don't even think personally my parents would have I think they'd be curious more than anything else. My dad is a very, very curious man. I think he'd be interested to kind of talk about different traditions and religions, but it's the organizational aspect which has enforced it and has kept it going. Um, so I think that's what makes it harder than most similar situations.
yeah. Yes, yes. There's that pressure from within, not to
Yeah.
like to keep that kind of thing going. What do you like? What is your view now? Your perspective now, having grown up with that, having become Catholic, having seen Protestant realities and explored that as well. What's your perspective now looking at the Jehovah's Witness religion? Like from where you are now, what do you what do you see it as? Like what? Because it's a strange animal. It's a strange
Mhm.
thing, right? It's you said very rules based, where God is kind of off in the distance and not really involved in your daily life. But there's it's intense, right? There's an intensity to it, and there's an immediacy to it, and there's obviously with the whole shunning culture, there's a closedness to it, right? I can only think of my own rubbing against that was I knew family members who were Jehovah's Witness who o- opened their arms to us and their homes to us and shared meals with us and we got along. There was always that kind of in the background thing that was different, but we we weren't Jehovah's Witness and left that, right? So we weren't in a place to be shunned or excluded, but there was differences there. I wonder now what your perspective is. What would for those of us who have never experienced that like you have, who don't understand that culture apart from hearing about it, like what takeaways do you have to give us for perspective?
Yeah, I mean, I think I think it's very much a utopian. It sounds weird to say because it's so kind of strict, but it's kind of a
Yeah, yeah,
utopian mentality because it's very much about washing your hands of the world, of the dysfunction of human life, of just the disappointments. I feel like one of the things about it, it's if you ever read 1984, it's very Orwellian, the information control that the Watchtower does. And I'm not trying to sound like some teenage liberal like
yeah,
critiquing religion, but like it is very, they present a certain reality and they control the information. So that is the reality that the witnesses live in.
yeah, yeah,
And it's a reality where truth can change from year to year and frequently does. And this year, it's the greatest thing that's ever been revealed to us by Jehovah God. But also, we're not like those evil Catholics who believe God speaks to them and through their Pope. So it's this weird tension between like, listen to us because we're inspired of God, but we're not like, the
yeah,
Pope telling you we're your authority or something.
yeah,
But
yeah,
it's, but it I just think it's in a utopian impulse because they don't want to accept the brokenness of the world, and so you retreat into this kind of this fake ideal reality created by a watchtower, and you don't allow yourself to think that anything's wrong. You're constantly told you're in a spiritual paradise and that everything is getting better in the watchtower and it's growing and um it's I don't know, it's a powerful drug, I think, for people. Um, People sometimes fundamentalist Protestants will say like, well, the Catholic Church is a cult. You follow a man or something, and I'm like, the Catholic Church is the will make you more normal. And yeah, I mean, the fact that
yeah,
we live, everything bad about our church is splashed on every headline before, as soon as it happens. You know what I mean? And we're constantly faced with told about the history of our church and how it was corrupt and everything is and everybody's you know it's all about money and all these other things. And I don't know, I just feel like as a Catholic, you learn to live in the brokenness of the world, you know what I mean? And our greatest saints do that. They go into
yeah,
brokenness and heal it, Mother Teresa and um, Saint Francis and these people. There's no hiding from the brokenness in Catholicism. There's no airbrushing reality to erase suffering and make it seem like it's all perfect and a little paradise. It's like, no, there's wheat and tares in this church, and that's okay. Like that's the way it's supposed to be. Like don't hide your eyes from it. But the witness is it's a very different controlled environment.
yeah. And you mentioned beauty too. Even when you were exploring the Reformed tradition, how beauty was something that was other, right? That was the Catholics had these things. The Reformed Church, right, had intentionally stripped things down. I can think of my Pentecostal church growing up when I became Christian in middle of high school. We had one single cross in the whole, we call it the sanctuary, the church proper, one single cross to the side of, not even in the center of the worship space, to the side, kind of out of the way, and everything else was just brick, just kind of plain brick. And that was an intentional choice, right? We're not Catholic. We don't have to have these busy things all in the way to idolize or to distract from God. We're stripped down. We're this is us, right? But you mentioned, especially in a, a religion like you say that's embracing that brokenness, that the beauty, that beauty is like the glimpse of something other, right? I think it's deeply attractive to many people coming from other traditions where that's not so important, and even those coming with no faith at all, right? This is a very maybe one of the most powerful witnesses we have these days in a largely post-religious world is the beauty, because you can't explain it and it's compelling, right?
Yeah, and I feel like it's witnesses are kind of the Protestants Protestant. I mean,
Yeah,
they take
yeah,
this Bible alone and this no images and everything to even similar. They don't even have one cross, and they don't
yes,
even
yeah,
use a
yeah,
cross. There is no imagery, no symbols in their places of meeting. Um, they take a lot of these kind of puritanical principles to their logical conclusion, in a way that other Protestants kind of dip their toes in, but the witnesses go 180, they're full speed ahead with this stuff. They've been translating their own Bible and kind of,
Yes, yeah.
and making that, I mean, they're non-Trinitarian. So, I mean, they make this final rationalistic push and just completely remove Christ from the Godhead. I think it just kind of dovetails with like what you're saying about this inability to deal with the complexity of life and of God's plan. It's like this reductionistic logic. I feel like that comes from, this modern period, and a lot of, and Protestantism is partaking of that, and witnesses are kind of taking it to its logical conclusion. You know, and it's this inability to appreciate the kind of that overflowing, I don't, messiness is not the word, but um activity of
Yeah.
truth and of the grandeur of the world, and the Catholic Church and its beauty and in its intricacy, can balance all of these things in this way that, it reminds me of Chesterton and Orthodoxy, talking about the million ways to fall, but there's one way to stand. It's like it somehow balances all these things, at the same time, and keeps them all in like healthy tension, and to where it's all part of the milieu that we can have. So I don't know, it's just more evidence for its divine foundation.
Yes, yes. I like how you talk about the Protestants Protestant, right? This is true of Mormonism too, in a large sense. It's these kind of outliers that grew from a Protestant tradition, right? Or were made possible through the idea of Protestantism, where we have sola scriptura, the Bible alone, apart from tradition. That kind of wrenching of tradition and scripture apart, right, is, I think, what many scholars would point to as what made these kinds of movements possible, right? And Mormonism, for example, again, similar in many respects to Jehovah's Witnesses in terms of the structure of belief systems and the addition of different organizations and kind of culture. It is kind of like the Protestant kind of uh, tangent that really digs down on things that a lot of Protestants will talk about, right? But just goes whole hog, right? Yes, there was an apostasy. Here's where it happened, right here. Yes, the Catholic Church is corrupt. Here's when and how it got corrupted. Here's how we're like these things that you can see grow out of Protestantism, and are just exaggerated, right, in Mormonism or in Jehovah's Witness communities, right? It's fascinating that these kind of things have the same kind of origin, and they're just enlarged in those groups, right? Those things exist in Protestantism. I would have, my Pentecostal church said, yeah, the Catholic Church became corrupt. I wouldn't have an exact date like my Mormon brother or sister would have to say when that happened, but I would kind of have an idea of this, right? But those, I think, like these groups really just put a point on the problem of Protestantism, because it's made these things possible and not so implausible, right?
Hmm.
You could argue very strongly, and there are fantastic Mormon apologists who do this, about why their belief system makes sense, or at least works in the bounds of like a sola scriptura kind of Christianity, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, that was one thing when I kind of really decided to prove Catholicism to myself, was the Trinity. I mean, there's a lot of, the witnesses really bear down hard on that one because they feel like they've got a good case.
Yeah.
And they don't, but there's a lot of, if you're coming from a sola scriptura framework, you can build a case for that. I
Right.
mean, you can
Yes.
build a
Yeah.
case for
Yeah.
any kind of contorted, contrived doctrine, um, out of that basis. And it was, I didn't talk about this as much, but going to the church fathers, I did do that at one point, and that helped a lot, because you saw the continuity
Yeah.
then. And I know this is a common refrain with converts, but you saw from the scriptures to the fathers to, on to the Catholic Church today, and that was undeniable.
Yeah. Yeah, that's fascinating, especially coming from a faith background that really has very recent origins, right? But has grandiose claims to kind of be right. Again, that
Hmm.
the same thing that Luther would do in 1500, right, is to make those claims. These are more modern versions of the same claims, right? Which again, I think just highlight the problematic nature of suddenly saying, no, that we're wrong, but I'm right now, right? What
Yeah.
makes you right? What makes him more right than than Joseph Smith was right? I mean, it's there's a lot to unpack there, but I think it's pretty fascinating. I wonder as we kind of wrap things up here, uh, bridges, inroads, ways to make connections. I mean, you've mentioned, and I can't imagine it's very easy because of the culture of shunning. I mean, you're an example of a difficult case, Dustin. That's not easy. But are there inroads? Are there is there ground to be gained for Catholics who have friends, who have family, who have, I mean, is there a way in to begin to ask questions and begin to foster a dialogue of any kind? Like, obviously this must be on your mind.
Oh yeah. No, it keeps me up at night, trying to, because yeah, it's such a formidable fortress
Yeah,
of resistance that a lot of Protestants don't have. They're kind of naive, and that's good because they're, oh, what do they want to know, they're curious about Catholicism, and then
yeah,
that's the tractor beam, and then they convert. But with witnesses, it's there's so many things that prevent that. um I don't know. As I've thought, I think it's more showing the fullness of Catholicism just lived,
yeah, yeah,
with
yeah, yeah,
all of its beauty. I mean, first of all, us us hopefully being as close to saints as we can be. I mean, that's always attractive, but just with our traditions, with holidays, with the pageantry and beauty of worship, all those things. I feel like if we lean into those things, and
yeah,
it's really clear the contrast, between what they're getting. Um, I just think that even as a boy who knew nothing about it, there was some inchoate attraction to this vision of Catholicism that played out when I got older. Even though I didn't, all these images I had in my head growing up,
yeah,
because Catholicism is culture. You know what I mean? I mean, we think about the
yeah.
medieval time and everything, and that's part of all of our cultural background, whether we know it or not. And so when we lean into that, I feel like that's a powerful evangelistic tool.
Yeah, yeah. I take your point because it's got to be right when you're coming from a culture, a faith culture that's very stripped down. We don't do holidays. We don't do these worldly things. We don't celebrate like that. That's gotta, yeah, work on the heart in ways that we can't even imagine how God is, working on those inroads. It's pretty fascinating. Any, in closing, any last words, last thoughts, things we didn't cover that you think our listeners, viewers, uh, worth hearing about?
Um, Not too much. I mean, I kind of, the last kind of battle I had, I struggled with Eastern Orthodoxy for a little bit, partly
Okay.
for these reasons, because
Yeah. Yeah.
there's a lot of beauty and tradition there. Um, and I think that's a tougher case, when you're looking at apologetics and trying to sort through all that stuff. But I came down and I kind of drew from my witness background as I decided to remain Catholic, was the universality of the church. And I think this is the biggest thing with Catholicism. It is the only universal society of the gospel that really fulfills the prophecies of the universe, of the worldwide spread of the church. From the rising of the sun to its setting, that pure sacrifice. All nations coming to Christ, and that's something you can't deny. You can't argue that away with like a random quote from a council in the 5th century. If you're
Yeah.
arguing with an Orthodox person, um, the universality of the Catholic Church is a brute fact, and the witnesses make a lot about their the form of universality that they have, because they're not nationalistic at all. And
Yeah.
so they have this very deep felt international brotherhood, even though they're only a tiny I think it's like 8 million people worldwide. Um, it's a tiny thing, but it's felt to be international, and they that's a proof for them that they are all over the world, and they're not, just tied to any one culture. And so kind of looking at Orthodoxy and then looking at Catholicism and seeing the difference in that universality, um, and then being able to offer that to witnesses and be like, you're right, that impulse of needing that international
Yes.
feeling,
Yeah.
but it's here. This is the only one that can really claim it if you're looking at the global situation. Um, so I just think using that as a proof and to help people see the truth of the church is helpful.
Yes, and that's a great proof for any non-Catholic Christian you're talking to, right? I mean, that was deeply compelling for me when I ran up against church issues that I couldn't resolve in my local non-denominational church, or in a larger denominational context, or in a larger Protestant context. Like I read the Reformers and from church history and realized how the Reformers couldn't agree amongst themselves and change their points of views even in their own lifetimes on different things. Yeah, discovering a universal church that has the authority to bind and loose, right? And can still meet in church councils to make decisions. Yeah, pretty compelling. And you realize pretty true, right? That has to be the way it has to be. There has to be
Mm.
that church. That's a great place to end off. Uh, Dustin, awesome conversation, awesome insights, amazing story, remarkable in many respects. So I thank you for being here and for sharing it, for your time. I will put links to your stuff, obviously, in the show notes. I mentioned before, your website is equally compelling. I got lost there in all the different faucets and stuff you write on there. It's awesome. What do you want to point listeners towards, viewers towards in particular, maybe? And I can put that stuff in the show notes too. What do you want to point them towards?
Yeah, just my website, shanelore.com. Just different stuff on there. The traditions tab, if you look at that, that kind of dovetails with what we're talking about bringing the liturgical life, the traditions, the beauty of this Catholic tradition into daily life. I think that is absolutely essential, especially if you got a family. Um, and then also on X, at DShaneTN, I just post occasionally on certain things. Don't have too much time. I've got a full-time job and a family, but sometimes. So if you're interested.
That sounds fantastic. I hear you. Not much free time for anything anymore.
Yeah.
It's a blessing, and yeah, it's wonderful. Listen, awesome. Thanks for being here, Dustin. I want to say God bless you. The work you are doing for the church. Thanks for your time here today. We're all very grateful. It's been an awesome ride, and thanks for sharing it with us. And God bless.
God bless. Thank you, Keith, for what you do.